Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo was born on November 1st, 1962, in Miami, Florida, a date that would later feel eerily symbolic. He entered the world on All Saints' Day. But instead of being raised in the light of saints, his life would be steeped in the shadows of dark rituals and forbidden faiths. His mother, Delia Aurora Gonzalez, was a Cuban immigrant who brought with her not only the struggles of exile, but also a deep devotion to Santeria and the African-rooted spiritual practices of the Caribbean. From his earliest years, Adolfo was surrounded by rituals, chants, candles, and the presence of deities not often spoken of in mainstream religion. Growing up, neighbors recalled the boy as quiet, mysterious, and sometimes unnerving. His mother took him to church on Sundays, but she also made offerings in secret to Oruses and spirits at home. By the age of 6, Adolfo had already been initiated into Santeria practices, standing at his mother's side during animal sacrifices. For most children, playtime meant toys and cartoons. For Adolfo, it meant watching chickens and goats bleed out in the name of protection and fortune. When his stepfather entered the picture, the family moved to Puerto Rico, and Adolfo's exposure to the occult only deepened. His stepfather was heavily involved in Palo Mayombe, one of the darkest and most feared Afro-Caribbean religions, notorious for its use of human bones in ritual magic. Unlike Santeria, which blended Catholic saints with African deities, Palo Mayombe was raw, brutal, and terrifying. The religion centered around the Nganga, a cauldron filled with sticks, bones, blood, and other offerings meant to house spirits of the dead. In this world, power came not through prayer, but through sacrifice. Adolfo became fascinated. His childhood was a paradox. On one hand, he served as an altar boy in Catholic churches, wearing the robes of innocence, reciting prayers. On the other, he watched blood being poured into cauldrons, skulls being used for divination, and magic invoked to control fate. By the time he was a teenager, he was already convinced that he had a destiny greater than ordinary men. A destiny rooted in supernatural power. When his stepfather died, Adolfo's family moved once again, this time settling in Mexico City. This relocation was crucial. The city in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a boiling pot of cultures, crime, and opportunity. It was a place where drug cartels were gaining strength, corruption was rampant, and people from all walks of life sought mystical protection. Adolfo quickly realized he had something to offer. He was young, handsome, charismatic, and most importantly, he carried an aura of mystery. In Mexico, he apprenticed under a local palaros, masters of Palo Mayombe, who trained him in the darkest arts. He learned how to prepare ritual cauldrons, how to summon spirits, and how to perform divinations for wealthy clients. By his early 20s, he was no longer just a student of magic. He was a practitioner, offering his services to those who could pay. Politicians, businessmen, police officers, and eventually drug traffickers came to him. They wanted blessings, protection power, and sometimes curses on their enemies. Adolfo gave them what they asked for, always for a price. His charm made him dangerous. To outsiders, he looked like a model, tall, well-dressed, with striking features. He was persuasive, intelligent, and had the ability to make people believe in his supernatural gifts. Clients left him convinced that his rituals worked. When their luck improved, they credited him. When their rivals suffered, they feared him. Adolfo thrived on this reputation, but it wasn't just about money. Deep inside, Adolfo believed he was chosen. He often compared himself to powerful magicians and prophets, claiming that he was not just a servant of spirits, but a master who commanded them. He told his followers that he was protected from bullets, that no harm could come to him as long as the Nganga was fed with the right sacrifices. In his twisted worldview, blood was power and power was survival. Adolfo's path took a darker turn when he began mingling with drug cartels. In the early 1980s, cocaine trafficking between Colombia, Mexico, and the United States was exploding. The cartels were ruthless, but they were also deeply superstitious. They believed in charms, blessings, and curses. To them, having a powerful magician on their side was as valuable as having a hitman. Adolfo seized this opportunity. He offered rituals promising protection from police, invincibility against enemies, and success in smuggling operations. At first, he used animal sacrifices, but soon he became convinced, or perhaps obsessed, that the spirits demanded more. By the mid-1980s, Constanzo had built a reputation not just as a brujo, a witch doctor, but as a man who could make anyone untouchable. Drug traffickers began paying him in large sums of cash, luxury cars, and even loyalty. With this wealth, he attracted followers. Some were drawn to his power, others to his charisma, and still others out of fear. Among them was Sara Aldrete, a young woman who would later be known as La Madrina, the godmother of his cult. But in the beginning, it was all about the transformation of Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo, a boy born in Miami, baptized in Catholic churches, raised in Santería, shaped by Palo Mayombe, and hardened in the streets of Mexico City. By his early 20s, he was no longer just Adolfo. He was a man convinced that spirits obeyed him, bullets could not touch him, and death itself was his ally. What began as a childhood surrounded by ritual had now evolved into something far darker. A foundation for the narco-satanist cult that would soon shock Mexico and the world. By the mid-1980s, Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo had already secured his reputation in Mexico City as a powerful brujo, a sorcerer who could bend fate. To many, he was not just a practitioner of Palo Mayombe, but a man with supernatural influence. Politicians slipped him envelopes of money, police officers sought him for blessings, and drug traffickers offered him gold and cars for protection in their dangerous trade. But for Adolfo, this was only the beginning. He didn't just want clients, he wanted disciples. He wanted a cult. Constanzo understood the psychology of power. He was strikingly handsome, articulate, and confident, which allowed him to control rooms full of people with just his presence. But beyond charisma, he used fear. He would tell his followers that he was bulletproof, that the spirits guarded him, and that anyone who betrayed him would suffer unspeakable consequences. To those living in the violent underworld of 1980s Mexico, such promises were intoxicating. Among his earliest and most loyal followers was Sara Aldrete, a young college student who, on the surface, seemed the least likely candidate for a life of ritual killings. Tall, intelligent, and deeply religious, Sara had been studying physical education. But beneath her disciplined exterior, she was drawn to mysticism. When she met Constanzo, she fell under his spell. He gave her a title, La Madrina, the godmother of his cult. To her, he was not just a man but a chosen one, a leader who offered her power she never imagined possible. Other followers included hardened criminals, drug dealers, and street thugs. Constanzo didn't just recruit, he initiated them. The rituals were terrifying but effective. Animal sacrifices escalated into more elaborate ceremonies involving blood, bones, and chants. Each new follower had to prove loyalty not only through obedience, but through their willingness to shed blood. Fear bound them together, and fear kept them loyal. Adolfo modeled his cult after both criminal organizations and ancient priesthoods. At the center of it all was the nganga, the sacred cauldron used in Palo Mayombe. Unlike traditional practitioners who filled the nganga with animal parts and sacred sticks, Constanzo took it further. He believed that true power came from human sacrifice. He began feeding the cauldron with human bones, organs, and blood, convinced that each offering made him and his followers stronger, invincible against their enemies. By this time, Constanzo was deeply embedded with Mexican cartels. He offered his magical services to traffickers, promising them safe passage for cocaine shipments, protection from police raids, and invulnerability in gunfights. The cartels, always looking for an edge, embraced him. Some feared him, others truly believed in his powers. For Constanzo, it was the perfect blend: money, influence, and human subjects for his rituals. The cult soon became known as Los Narcosatánicos, the Narco-Satanists, though Constanzo never openly called himself satanic. The public would later use this name to describe the grotesque mix of cartel violence and black magic that defined his group. Inside his inner circle, however, he was more than a leader. He was a god. His followers addressed him as El Padrino, the Godfather. He demanded loyalty, obedience, and faith. Rituals became a regular occurrence. The cult would gather in secluded ranches or hidden rooms. They would light candles, chant in Spanish and Yoruba, and prepare victims for sacrifice. Constanzo told his followers that spilling blood was essential for feeding the spirits. If the cauldron was not fed, the spirits would abandon them, and they would lose their protection. Fear of losing this supernatural shield kept the group committed, no matter how brutal the rituals became. For Adolfo, violence was not just ritualistic, it was strategic. He believed human sacrifice ensured his cartel partners' success. When shipments crossed borders safely, when rivals mysteriously disappeared, or when gun battles ended in his allies' favor, Constanzo pointed to the nganga as the source of victory. Each success reinforced his followers' faith. They became convinced that their leader controlled fate itself. But Constanzo's ambitions extended beyond Mexico. He traveled frequently to the United States, especially Texas, where he cultivated wealthy clients in the occult underground. He performed readings, cast spells, and convinced Americans to pay him thousands for rituals promising love, health, and prosperity. These trips gave him a taste of international influence, fueling his desire for even greater power. Back in Mexico, his cult grew bolder. Sara Aldrete acted as his second in command, managing daily operations and ensuring discipline among the followers. She projected the image of a loyal, almost priestess-like figure, reinforcing Constanzo's authority. Other members carried out killings, abductions, and drug operations, often blurring the line between crime and ritual. What distinguished Constanzo's cult from ordinary criminal gangs was the fusion of religion and violence. To outsiders, it looked like savage crime. But to his followers, each murder was sacred, each scream an offering, each drop of blood a covenant with the spirits. This dual identity, half cult, half cartel, gave them an aura of invincibility. They believed bullets could not kill them, police could not catch them, and enemies could not defeat them. But with each sacrifice, Constanzo also grew darker. His obsession with death intensified. He began demanding that sacrifices must be intelligent, strong, or even innocent, qualities he claimed gave the spirits greater power. This shift marked a new level of horror, for it meant that the cult would no longer limit themselves to criminals or enemies. Anyone could be a target. By the late 1980s, whispers of strange disappearances, mutilated bodies, and eerie rituals began spreading in northern Mexico, particularly around the city of Matamoros, near the U.S. border. Locals spoke of a cult that kidnapped people at night, a cult that left bodies without brains, hearts, or limbs. For many, these stories sounded like urban legends. But for those living closest to the cult's ranches, the fear was real. Constanzo, however, saw none of this as madness. In his eyes, he was fulfilling destiny. He believed he was chosen to be more than a man, chosen to be a sorcerer, king who ruled both the spiritual and the criminal world. Each ritual was a step closer to immortality, each follower a soldier in his army, and each sacrifice a promise of eternal power. The cult of death was no longer a secret circle of believers. It was becoming a criminal empire wrapped in the cloak of religion, one that would soon capture the world's attention with a crime so shocking, so brutal, that it would forever link Constanzo's name to terror. By the late 1980s, Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo and his cult, known as Los Narcosatánicos, had moved their operations to a ranch outside Matamoros, near the Texas-Mexico border. To drug traffickers, the ranch was a safe house for smuggling, but to Constanzo and his followers, it became something far darker, a temple of death. Within its walls, rituals were carried out under the cover of night. Fires lit up the darkness, drums echoed in the air, and terrified victims became unwilling offerings to the spirits Constanzo claimed to command. The cult's rituals followed a gruesome pattern. Victims were kidnapped, sometimes criminals, sometimes rivals, and eventually innocent people. They were tied up, tortured, and killed in ways that served both practical and symbolic purposes. Some had their hearts ripped out, others were dismembered. Most were decapitated. Their remains were fed into the ganga, the ritual cauldron filled with blood, bones, sticks, and other macabre items. For Constanzo, each death was not murder, it was magic. He told his followers that these sacrifices gave them protection, prosperity, and invulnerability. At first, the cult's victims came from the world of crime. Drug dealers who crossed them, cartel rivals, or individuals who knew too much. But Constanzo's appetite for sacrifice grew insatiable. He began insisting that the spirits demanded better offerings, young men, intelligent and strong, whose life energy would give the cauldron more power. This shift marked the beginning of a series of murders that horrified the world. The most infamous case was that of Mark Kilroy, a 21-year-old pre-med student from the University of Texas. In March 1989, Kilroy traveled with friends to Matamoros for spring break. Like thousands of other American students who flocked to the border town for partying. On the night of March 13, after leaving a bar, Kilroy became separated from his friends. He never returned. What seemed at first like a tragic disappearance soon revealed something unimaginable. Constanzo's followers had spotted Kilroy near the border. To them, he was the perfect target. Young, healthy, intelligent, and, above all, American. They lured him away, forced him into a car, and drove him to the ranch. There, Kilroy was tied up and held for hours, perhaps even overnight. When the ritual began, Constanzo personally took part. Kilroy was bludgeoned with a machete, then killed with a blow to the back of the neck. His brain was removed and placed in the nganga. For the cult, it was a sacrifice of immense power. For his family and friends, it was the beginning of a nightmare. When Kilroy disappeared, his parents immediately alerted authorities. The case quickly gained attention in both the United States and Mexico. The FBI, DEA, and Mexican federal police became involved, launching one of the most extensive manhunts in border history. What no one yet realized was that Kilroy's disappearance would unravel the entire cult. As the investigation widened, police began to connect a series of disappearances in Matamoros to the same area. Locals whispered about strange rituals at a ranch known as Rancho Santa Elena. Acting on tips, Mexican authorities raided the property in April 1989. What they found shocked even the most hardened officers. Buried in shallow graves around the ranch were the remains of over a dozen victims. Bodies were mutilated, missing hearts, brains, and limbs. Inside a shack, investigators discovered the nganga, filled with skulls, bones, blood, and animal remains. In one pot, they found a human spinal column. The stench was overwhelming, the sight unbearable. It was evidence not of ordinary cartel violence, but of systematic, ritualistic murder. When police realized that one of the bodies belonged to Mark Kilroy, the case became international news. American headlines screamed of satanic cult killings in Mexico. The public was horrified not only by the brutality, but also by the idea that a cult was operating alongside drug traffickers, blending superstition with organized crime. For Constanzo's followers, however, the ranch was sacred ground. They insisted the rituals worked. They believed that without the cauldron, they would lose the protection that had shielded them for years. Even as police closed in, some members refused to abandon their faith in Constanzo. Sara Aldrete, La Madrina, insisted that everything they had done was necessary, that the spirits demanded it, and that Adolfo was chosen by destiny. But the discovery of Rancho Santa Elena exposed the cult to the world. What had been whispered in fear was now undeniable fact. The Narcosatánicos were no longer a shadowy rumor. They were killers, torturers, and practitioners of a black magic so extreme that even other cartel leaders distanced themselves from it. The murders of Matamoros revealed the depths of Constanzo's obsession with power. He was no longer just a brujo serving clients. He was a man who believed he was invincible, who believed that spilling blood made him untouchable. Each victim, in his eyes, was not a human being, but a stepping stone to greater strength. The horror of Mark Kilroy's death galvanized both U.S. and Mexican authorities. No longer was this just another cartel case. It was an international scandal, and the pressure to capture Constanzo and his cult was immense. For the first time, the man who had convinced his followers he was bulletproof began to face the one enemy he could not charm, curse, or intimidate: the law. The discovery of Rancho Santa Elena in April 1989 changed everything. For years, Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo had operated in the shadows, his cult's rituals whispered about but never confirmed. Now the world knew the truth. The shallow graves, the mutilated remains, and the cauldron filled with human bones painted a portrait of unimaginable evil. For the families of the victims, there was grief and outrage. For law enforcement, there was a mission to capture the man known as El Padrino, the godfather of death. Constanzo, however, was not a man easily cornered. Once he learned that the ranch had been exposed, he fled with several loyal followers, including Sara Aldrete. They moved between safe houses in Mexico City, constantly shifting locations to stay ahead of the police. Despite the chaos, Constanzo remained defiant. He told his disciples that he could not be killed, that bullets would bounce off his body, and that the spirits would protect them. For a time, his followers believed him, but fear was closing in. Authorities on both sides of the border launched an intensive manhunt. The disappearance and murder of Mark Kilroy had put enormous pressure on Mexican officials. The United States government demanded justice, and international media coverage kept the case in the spotlight. Police raids spread across Matamoros and Mexico City, searching for any trace of the cult leader. Constanzo, however, thrived on the drama. He enjoyed the notoriety. Inside his hideouts, he continued performing rituals, burning candles, and consulting his nganga. He promised his followers that they would survive, that the law had no power against his magic. But beneath his calm exterior, cracks were forming. He knew that capture was inevitable, and he would never allow himself to be humiliated in chains. On May 6, 1989, police finally closed in on a luxury apartment in Mexico City, where Constanzo and his followers were hiding. As officers surrounded the building, Constanzo panicked. The man who had once claimed to control fate now realized his own was slipping away. Instead of surrendering, he grabbed a machine gun and began firing out of the window. For nearly 45 minutes, a gun battle raged between the cult leader and police. Bullets ripped through the apartment, glass shattered, and smoke filled the air. Inside, Constanzo faced a choice as capture or death. For a man who had built his identity on power and fear, surrender was unthinkable. He turned to one of his most loyal followers, a man named Alvaro de Leon Valdez, and gave him an order: do it. Constanzo demanded to be killed. He believed dying by a follower's hand would preserve his dignity and deny the police the satisfaction of taking him alive. With no hesitation, de Leon opened fire, killing Constanzo instantly, along with another cult member. When police finally stormed the apartment, they found the so-called Narco Satanist slumped on the floor. His reign of terror ended not by law enforcement, but by his own command. Sara Aldrete, La Madrina, was captured alive. To authorities, she initially portrayed herself as a victim, claiming Constanzo had manipulated and threatened her. But investigators soon discovered that she had been deeply involved, not just a bystander, but a partner in running the cult. She was eventually convicted and sentenced to decades in prison. Even behind bars, Aldrete maintained that Constanzo had possessed extraordinary powers, and that she had been under his spell. The death of Constanzo sent shockwaves through Mexico and the United States. For many, it was the first time they had seen the worlds of drug trafficking, black magic, and ritual murder collide so violently. Newspapers dubbed him the Narco Satanist, and his cult became infamous worldwide. Some saw him as a madman, others as proof of the extreme lengths cartels would go for power. But Constanzo's story did not end with his death. In the years that followed, his crimes became the subject of books, documentaries, and horror films. Urban legends spread across Mexico, claiming his spirit still roamed the borderlands. Parents warned their children to avoid strangers, invoking his name as a cautionary tale. In Matamoros, the memory of Rancho Santa Elena lingered like a scar, a reminder of the darkness that had once gripped the town. For criminologists and historians, Constanzo's cult remains a disturbing case study in the power of belief. His followers were not mindless. Many were educated, intelligent, and capable. Yet under his influence, they committed atrocities, convinced that each act of violence was sacred. Constanzo had exploited fear, faith, and superstition to build a cult that blurred the line between religion and crime. His legacy also highlighted the vulnerability of societies where corruption and violence create fertile ground for extremism. In a world where cartels ruled with fear, a man like Constanzo could convince others that magic was as powerful as guns. His followers believed they were untouchable, right up until the moment bullets pierced the apartment walls and their leader lay dead. Today, more than 3 decades later, the story of Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo continues to fascinate and horrify. He was a man born into rituals, shaped by darkness, and consumed by his own delusions of power. His life was a collision of religion, crime, and madness. His death was a violent finale to one of the most chilling chapters in Mexico's history. For the families of his victims, no ritual, no magic, no belief could ever justify the suffering he caused. Their loved ones were not sacrifices. They were lives stolen by a man who believed himself above humanity. And so, the name Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo lives on, not as a prophet or protector, but as a symbol of how belief, when corrupted by ambition and cruelty, can become a weapon deadlier than any gun. His cult is gone, his cauldron shattered, but his dark legacy remains, a warning etched in blood, fear, and memory.